So another concept that we think about when laying out our UVs is whether or not to overlap them. In film, we almost never overlap UVs just because it means that both those parts are going to look exactly the same. The reason we would overlap UVs is to increase texture resolution of one specific part. By overlapping the UVs, you can take up more of the map for that piece, and then both sides of it or both parts will get more detail or more pixels allotted to it. In some instances, we can't even do it at all. So if you think about some packages, we're going to do a process called baking out normal maps and displacement maps. And some of those, if UVs are overlapping, it'll actually crash the program. There's ways around this, but I just want you to be aware of that. If you do get to a point where you're trying to overlap UVs for a certain project and the packages keep crashing, that potentially could be the reason why. So over here, again on my Pinterest board, I have a good example of maybe why we would use overlapping UVs. So this is a model from a video game. They're using 3 different texture spaces or UV spaces to map out the entire character. But if you look at the head here, they cut it right down the center. So if this was a 512 texture, half of that would be allotted to half the face. So by mapping it in this way, we're getting pretty much a 512 texture for the entire face, which is great for texture resolution, and we're saving on the amount of maps we use. So remember, each one of these maps is a certain file size, and you only have so much RAM on your video cards or your graphics cards. So we want to be conscious of that when we're making game assets. So this is a great way to kind of save on how much space we're using and still get a nice amount of resolution. The downfall to mapping things out this way is that both sides of his face will look exactly the same, right? Which means we can't really get asymmetry in our model. So his head, his hands, and his pants would look the same on both sides. Here they mapped out the coat or the flak jacket entirely. And then so we could get some asymmetry into the parts that way. I was just looking actually on his jacket. It looks like the arm they didn't map out all the way, so they must be overlapping the arm. So the arm would look the same on both sides, but the front and the back of that jacket would potentially look different. So when you look through UV maps, you'll see times where they use the entire resolution. So this, because she has a scar, right, we didn't want to overlap these two pieces because we couldn't have this asymmetry if we did that. Something like this with, I think that's a leg. I'm going to go with that's a leg. This pattern that's on there, right? It almost looks the same on both sides. I guess I'm seeing some slight differences in it, but that might be a reason where we wouldn't notice the repeatable pattern, or maybe it's okay to have a repeatable pattern with that, and we could have overlapped those two to get higher resolution. This would also go back to thinking about, do we want even textile density versus uneven? If we start overlapping stuff, certain areas are going to have more texture resolution, most likely. So we're kind of fighting between that even versus uneven textile density. So again, that's the reasons why we would or would not overlap certain areas. For this class, we're not going to overlap any of our UVs, so just keep that in mind. But just start studying some texture maps. And by looking at these texture maps, you see the exact way that someone laid out their UVs.